Last week I took you through the first 7 verses of Genesis 3 to that point in the narrative where our first parents' eyes were opened, and they saw that, horrors, they were naked, and they made fig leaf loincloths to hide their shame. Today I'll take up the reading with verse 8. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." He said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" The man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent tricked me, and I ate." The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." To the woman he said, "I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And to the man he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." I'll save the rest of the reading for later. Let's examine what we've seen here. I guess it's already obvious that for this story to make any sense, we're going to have to set aside such notions as the omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence of God. None of those apply here. I wonder what Christians do when they read this story. Do they even notice the contradictions between classical conceptions of God and what they read here? Do they draw themselves up short when they see the Lord God waiting until the cool of the day to take a stroll in the garden so as not to break a sweat? Does God really need for the man to reveal his hiding place, or to ask him whether he had eaten that fruit? I honestly can't remember what I thought of those details in this story when I was a Christian, assuming I thought about them at all. Do most Christians just not think about them at all? I guess that's why I lost my faith. Once I started thinking, I didn't stop. Well, Martin Luther did say that reason is the greatest enemy that faith has. Again, would an omniscient God need for the man to tell him how he found out he was naked? Didn't God already know that? Or was he just trying to get the man to reflect on his folly? At any rate, the blame game begins, and the man tries to shift the blame both to his creator and to the woman. You gave me a woman, and she gave me the fruit. God is rather more brutal and direct with the woman. "What the hell have you done?" The woman, of course, blames the snake. God has no questions for the snake. He just starts cursing him and doesn't stop until he's cursed everything: the snake, the woman, the man, and the ground he tills. Spiteful old cuss, ain't he? Over a piece of fruit. Of course, all the things I've just asked are rhetorical questions, because any thoughtful, reasonable person will already long since have understood that all of this is metaphorical. Only fundamentalists imagine that they're reading history here. It's a mystery to me. Are Ken Ham and Kent Hovind and all those other snake oil salesmen really stupid enough to believe that shit they're peddling? Or are they just pretending because they found a living in it? Of course, I wonder the same thing about televangelists and other faith healers, and I really wonder about all the millions of people who send money to hucksters like these. I think it's worth pointing out, although I'm not sure exactly what to make of it, that although the third chapter of Genesis is, like the second that introduced it, couched in prose, God's curses are all in verse, and my New Revised Standard Version shows that, as do most scholarly modern editions of the Bible. Let's have a look at those curses. First, he speaks to the snake in verse. Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. I suppose we have an etiology here that accounts for two things. The fact that snakes go upon their bellies instead of walking or flying, and the fact that people seem to have an innate fear of them. Of course, the very fact that God has cursed this creature to get along without legs and feet suggests that the snake had legs and feet before he led that poor woman astray. Some traditions also grant it wings. Serpent seems to be a broad category, including everything from garter snakes to vipers to griffins to dragons to the Antichrist. Jesus also referred to a council of Pharisees as a generation of vipers, and the mushroom-chomping prophet of Patmos who saw all those horrific visions there at the end of the Bible was treated to a vision of Satan himself, that old serpent. What to make of this, I do not know. A serpent can be almost anything, apparently, including a truth-teller. The snake is the only character in this tale who told the unvarnished truth. Of course, there are probably plenty of other dimensions to this story, including the likely phallic symbolism of the snake and the fact that certain Christian legends during the Middle Ages depicted the snake as a woman, even connecting her to Lilith, the most notorious demon in Jewish tradition, who in some sources is conceived of as the original woman created even before Eve. God has only half as much to say to the woman as he did to the snake. I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. I'm not quite sure what to say about this. I suppose that on the author's view, it's possible that God's original design was for the females of the human species to be able to give birth as easily as the females of all other eutherian mammals. It does seem that there's a real difference there. I understand that there are several important factors at work that make childbirth so difficult for our kind, perhaps the most important being that our hips are so much narrower than those of other great apes specifically and other mammals generally. That narrowing was in connection with our full bipedality compared to the other apes, along with other human peculiarities that have made us the champion runners of the animal kingdom, which could very well have conferred such an adaptive advantage on humans that it would have been selected for, even at the cost of great difficulty, suffering, and outright danger in childbirth. But of course the authors of this tale would not have understood that, any more than they understood that snakes evolved from lizards and so did indeed at one time have legs and feet. But since they didn't understand that loss of limbs to be the result of hundreds of millions of years of tetrapod evolution, they characterized that loss as a divine punishment, just as they did the great danger of childbirth in humans. This story gives that kind of explanation for the suffering. The thing I've always found most puzzling about God's quatrain here is its second couplet. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. It's that yet that's puzzling to me. Grammatically, the function of that word is to yield the following meaning of verse 16. Despite all the pain in childbearing, your desire shall be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now, what exactly does that mean? This is poetry, and I can't help reading it the same way I read similar structures in music. That last line is what follows logically from what went before it. That's the nature of this couplet. In other words, the couplet's first line is antecedent in quality. Your desire shall be for your husband. And the second is consequent, and he shall rule over you. This seems to suggest that what gives the man power over the woman is her desire for him. She's lustful. She's therefore untrustworthy. You better keep her on a short leash. Maybe keep her hidden. And for God's sake, don't let her drive or vote. Let me treat you to a little bonbon from the lyrical poetry of the prophet Jeremiah. This is from chapter 2. How can you say, I am not defiled, I have not gone after the Baals? Look at your way in the valley, know what you have done. A restive young camel interlacing her tracks, a wild ass at home in the wilderness, in her heat sniffing the wind. Who can restrain her lust? Be wary of lust. Look up some of the twisted shit in Ezekiel sometime. Just call up a Bible Gateway search, choose your favorite translation, and search under lust. Here's St. Paul to the Thessalonians. For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from fornication, that each one of you know how to control your own body in holiness and honor, not with lustful passion like the Gentiles who do not know God. That must have been some really powerful fruit. It put a hex on sex for sure. Let's see what God has in store for the man. Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. I've never heard appropriate emphasis laid on what seems to me glaringly obvious. God is as misogynistic as the culture that wrote these tales. Note that the punishments God's about to heap on this sinner are because you have listened to the voice of your wife. I don't see how that can be insignificant. God could just as easily have begun with, because you have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. But he didn't, because the act of eating was only the consequence of his having committed the ultimate sin, listening to the voice of his wife. Do you remember that passage I quoted from 1 Timothy a couple of lessons ago? Here's the conclusion of it. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she shall be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. Obviously, St. Paul was riffing on this account in Genesis 3. It's worth our while to focus on a single phrase of that riff. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. According to St. Paul, Adam knew what he was doing and didn't become a transgressor by doing it. It's all the woman's fault. Spend some time with that someday and just sit quietly and let the full horror of it wash over you. Again, I do not understand how any woman can be a Christian. I say that in all sincerity. Now let's take a look at the punishment God has in mind for the man. It might be worth noting that God only cursed two things in this story outright: the serpent and the ground from which the man was going to have to wrest a living. He did not curse the woman, although he sure laid some awful punishments on her and said some insulting things about her. He didn't curse the man either, but he let it be clear that he intended to work that man's ass off. I have a feeling the original garden practically tended itself. We also see at the end of God's expression of righteous judgment another formally satisfying counterpoint with chapter 2. There, the Lord God made man of the dust of the ground. Here, he's informed that he will someday return to that dust. If you look carefully at this text, I believe you'll be struck by something that tends to go unnoticed. Many people consider death to be part of the punishment, but I don't believe this story actually indicates that. That man, and presumably his wife, were mortal already, mortal from the day they were made. Otherwise, why would the tree of life be included in the garden, as in chapter 2? That, by the way, is imagery that returns in the very last chapter of the Bible. Then he showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city. Also, on either side of the garden, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Make of that whatever can be made of it. We now have before us the wrap-up of the story, a sort of coda in two parts. Part 1 is found in verses 20 and 21. The man named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. And the Lord God made garments of skins for the man and for his wife and clothed them. The name Eve resembles a Hebrew word for living, so our first mother's name was a pun. I've heard verse 21 interpreted by Christians as a messianic type. In order to cover the sinfulness of the man and his lately named wife, the blood of an innocent animal had to be shed. I'm sure you know where Christians take it from there, even if you've never run into it before. Perhaps there is some deep symbolism in this verse that escapes me, but I rather suspect that its purpose is to reinforce points that I've already drawn your attention to. You will wear whatever the dear leader wants you to wear. He will prescribe that for you just as he does everything else. Wear your uniform, march in lockstep, and do not presume. That's the central message of this story, isn't it? In fact, isn't that the central message of the entire Bible? The final 3 verses constitute a postscript and begin with what appears to be a polytheistic confab. Then the Lord God said, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim, and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life. That one of us in verse 22 is somewhat embarrassing for those with a deep commitment to monotheism, although of course some Christians see in it an Old Testament reference to the Holy Trinity. I don't buy that, do you? As I've already pointed out, monotheism grew out of a polytheistic matrix. Perhaps better said, it was teased out of a polytheistic matrix by way of henotheism and codified by a priesthood who were already allied with the monarchy of King David, at whose request many of these stories were assembled into a kind of national myth for political purposes. That's a topic I may well address in the future. At any rate, God certainly reveals his own hand here when he expresses his concern that the man might live forever while knowing what he does, and that's not acceptable to this tyrant. The awakened moral agency of his subjects is a threat to this autocrat, so he goes full Stalin on their asses, sends them packing to Siberia. These freshly awakened, newly mature humans are made to suffer because of the insecurity of the man on the throne. Does that remind you of anyone? The last thing I want to say about this tale is that the ending certainly does provide a rich image and even sets forth a kind of principle that's worth considering, which is virtually every bridge we cross personally and that humankind has ever crossed collectively is a bridge burnt. Once a society goes from foraging to agriculture, there's simply no return to foraging. I've had my attention called to a vanishingly small number of temporary exceptions, but they are truly exceptions that prove the rule. Once a city is built, the planet is doomed to be covered in them. Once a war is fought in the name of some god or other, that pattern will persist until the end of human time. Once a planet is destroyed, there's no getting it back. Once we lose our innocence, there's no regaining it. Once we're born, death is inevitable. Not a very uplifting message, is it? Well, it's the story of the fall, so what did you expect? And this isn't your ordinary Sunday school. Tune in next week when we'll talk about murder.